Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's NKBA KBIS Design Webinar, Zero Carbon Homes, Pioneering a Sustainable Future. As we continue our theme of sustainability for the month of April, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Sarah Gutterman, CEO of Green Builder Media. Sarah, please take it away.
Wonderful. Hello there. And thank you so much for being here with me today. Today, we get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is net zero carbon homes and buildings and how we decarbonize the built environment. So first, let me just start with, again, a warm thank you to NKBA for having me on another webinar. I get to do these from time to time and always enjoy them. And thank you again to everyone here for spending about an hour with me today. If you're not familiar with Green Builder Media, let me just provide a little bit of context. We are North America's leading media company focused on green building and sustainable living. Hopefully you have heard about us because 2025 is our 20th anniversary. We've been here for quite a while, and we do, of course, media and communications, demonstration projects, events, and last but not least, we have something called Cognition Smart Data, which is our market intelligence and data services division. So a lot of the data and the insights that you're going to be hearing about today come from our Cognition Smart Data. So if you see a reference to Cognition or hear me source Cognition, that's what I'm talking about. The reason why it is so important that we are here today is that we just have to decarbonize our built environment. And it's partly because of our very real climate needs. But beyond that, we are realizing that decarbonization of our economy, of the built environment in general, is actually presenting a tremendous economic opportunity, a revolution unlike really anything that we've seen before in terms of energy efficiency, electrification, resiliency, intelligence, and smart home capabilities, healthy home. All of these things are pillars and tenets of decarbonization. And I'll talk about how we get to a decarbonized built environment. But I think really for you all, given the profile of the audience today, what I would like to submit to you is, let me explain. Sustainability is now becoming transactional. And what I like to say is, in the 2008 recession was the best thing that really ever happened to energy efficiency because people became cognizant of their energy bills. And the pandemic did the same thing for healthy home. The COVID really pulled the concept of healthy home to the forefront of our national and international dialogue and brought a new level of awareness about healthy home because we were told for years that our homes were the only place we could be and not get sick. Similarly, I think because of what is happening in the world today, sustainability is transforming from a nice to have or an add-on to something that is very transactional. And what I mean by that is now, as people are talking about sustainability and decarbonization, it's really more about risk reduction, increasing profit, reducing costs, making homes and buildings just better, right? More efficient, healthier, more intelligent. And it's also about bolstering supply chains. So there's a lot that's being packed into this concept of decarbonization that we'll go through today. But there's really three fundamental pillars of the decarbonization of the built environment. And it, of course, starts with performance. So we have to deploy climate responsive design and building science and green building best practices. We'll go into some of those in a minute. The second tenet is the meticulous specification of low carbon products from low carbon companies. And we'll talk about that in a little while as well. And then the third pillar has to do with carbon offsets. And carbon offsets historically have had a little bit of a bad rap because there have been some bad actors in that space. But we'll talk about the differentiation between high quality and low quality carbon offsets and why they are so fundamentally important to kind of reaching that last mile of decarbonization. So why does this even matter, right? You probably understand, and that's why you're here. But really, there is this trifecta of environmental, social, and financial reality that's happening right now. From an environmental standpoint, the facts are We hit 1.5 degrees warming in the last 12 to 18 months. And really, we're going to 2 degrees in the next 12 to 18 months. Some climate scientists say that could be 6 to 8 months, and really that we're already there. And that is just a reality that we need to not just recognize, but plan for and prepare for. We know that from an environmental standpoint, climate events are becoming increasingly frequent and catastrophic. So whether we call it climate change or we just call it increasing frequency and intensity of climate events, it doesn't really matter what language we use. These things are happening, and we have to design and build differently because of that. The social reality is that we have younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs, and soon Gen Alphas, that are buying homes and entering the workplace or in the workplace with very different expectations about what they want from their homes, from their places of work, from their employers. There's very high levels of stress and anxiety about the future. Some Cognition Smart data shows that 3/4 of these younger generations consider the future to be frightening, and over half think that humanity is doomed because of climate change. Now, that's not 6 or 16%, that's 56%. That is incredibly high and just too high for comfort. But then on top of that, there is this perfect storm of demand drivers. We're seeing shifting investor expectations, shifting lender expectations. I don't have this listed on here, but how about the insurance crisis, right? That's a whole conundrum that we could spend an entire webinar talking about in terms of availability and cost of insurance for homes and for the built environment. And as we see more and more of the national insurance players pull out of markets, we're going to start either seeing entrepreneurial companies fill that gap, or in some cases, we might actually start seeing some of the big builders offering their own insurance policies and vehicles. We're starting to hear a little bit of talk about that. But we are also starting to see more supply chain partners, not just in the building industry. How about Walmart? That's really leading this charge, requiring that their vendors have very strong decarbonization and sustainability practices in place. And then, of course, municipalities. And we'll talk about the shifting code and regulatory environment in a little while as well, to kind of bolster this line of thinking about the financial reality and what's happening there. But it's very real. And whether or not it's being recognized, say, at the federal government level, or not, it's happening, and certainly something that we all need to be paying attention to. And this is all particularly important for the built environment. These stats have been around for a long time, so I am going to presume that many of you are familiar with them. But according to the Department of Energy, homes and buildings in the US account for 40% of our nation's total energy use, 70% of electricity use, 40% of emissions. And we have to get to a 50% reduction by 2030. And that's like tomorrow, of emissions from the built environment, and 100% reduction by 2050 if we have a chance at hitting our climate targets in terms of not going over that 2 degrees temperature rise. And by the way, just for some context, in case you don't know this, climate scientists set that 2-degree warming threshold not because they think that we are absolutely, our ecosystems are going to collapse over 2 degrees Celsius. They think that that's possible, but it's really because their scientific models don't work over 2 degrees warming because of what's called a threat multiplier of climate change. So that's why that 2-degree threshold is set, because once we go over that, we're basically flying blind and we really can't model what's going to happen. Unfortunately, not even 1% of existing buildings are considered net zero carbon today. So clearly we have a massive road ahead of us in terms of amount of change that we have to implement. But of course, again, The flip side of that is the tremendous amount of opportunity and innovation that we get to implement. And I think that we could look at this as something that's very scary or something that's very exciting. Fortunately, what we have seen in the last several years is that the conversation in the building industry has shifted from net zero energy to net zero carbon. And when we talk about decarbonization and we talk about net zero carbon, that really involves everything from the extraction of the first material that goes into a home or a building, all the way through to transportation, manufacturing, packaging, more transportation, installation, operations, and then end of life. So it's a complete cycle and it's pretty comprehensive. That full cycle, by the way, when you hear about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute too, scope 3 emissions encompasses that full life cycle. So when the SEC decided to only include scope 1 and 2 in their reporting requirements, and by the way, those are up in the air. We'll see if they'll actually implement those requirements or not, given what's happening at the federal level. But the reason why they left out scope 3 requirements is because they are very comprehensive, and there were so many businesses that were like, wow, let's just start with scope 1 and 2, maybe get to scope 3 later. With that said, the European Union is requiring scope 3 reporting. So companies that do business in Europe are already getting used to it. There are proactive companies here in the US that are already reporting scope 3. So we are going to start seeing more and more of that. What we do know, and this comes from our Cognition Smart data, is that there is a positive perspective in the consumer market for decarbonization. So we have this chart on the left asking our consumer audience, and we reach millions of early adopter and first mover consumers. So they are committed to sustainability. And when we ask our consumer audience what they're thinking, it's kind of like having a crystal ball, so to speak, because I will say our audience is maybe 6, 12, 18, maybe up to 24 months ahead of the mainstream market. But you can see the younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs, believe that decarbonization is helpful to business and that it results in enhanced innovation, it generates positive brand equity, yields greater financial returns, and helps to mitigate risk. So there's really no ambiguity these days. When we ask our consumer audience how important it is to them to live in a net zero carbon home, again, you can see the younger the generation, the more important it is to them. We also ask our consumer audience, and this comes from just a brand new hot off the press survey that we just did. Millennials and Gen Zs are more willing to pay for sustainability upgrades, whether those are for new construction or retrofits, if those upgrades will lower their ongoing cost of home ownership over time. And that's across the board, whether that's energy efficiency, electrification, healthy home, water conservation, solar plus storage, smart home, or resiliency. And it's because, and this is the first time that our consumer audience actually responded, all 4 generations, boomers, Xers, millennials, and Zs, now tell us that they look at long-term value and ongoing operating costs more so than first cost or upfront price per square foot. And what that indicates is that there is a shifting valuation metric for homes at this point that includes the total cost of homeownership as opposed to just that first cost. And again, that's a mindset shift. It has never before in our 20 years of surveying our consumer audience, never before have we had all of the active home buyer generations tell us that they're looking more at that long-term value of homeownership, which includes the operating costs, of course, having to do with energy efficiency. It has to do with grid independence. Do they have solar plus storage? Can they keep their home powered if the grid, well, at this point, when the grid goes down for whatever reason, whether that's because of a superstorm or a wildfire or just grid overload? Can their homes keep them healthy? Can their homes proactively provide diagnostics before a water heater or an HVAC system end up going out? So there's a lot of considerations now when buying and remodeling homes that weren't necessarily as applicable even 2 to 5 years ago. I will say this is a mentality that millennials brought with them even before the pandemic that indicated a mindset shift when buying homes, and it's only growing in terms of application across all 4 generations. When we ask our building professional audience, which is comprised of a couple 100,000 builders, developers, architects, designers, energy raters, et cetera, we are seeing increased demand for sustainability products, again, pretty much across the board, leading, of course, with energy efficiency products like insulation, windows and doors, lighting, certainly smart home systems, heat pump technologies, whether those are HVACs, water heaters, or dryers, solar plus storage, and indoor air quality systems and induction cooktops. Our builder audience is also much more open to adopting sustainable products really than ever before. Again, we've been surveying them for 20 years. And so now they're looking at things like demand side energy management systems. So maybe those are smart panels like from Span or Schneider Electric demand side energy management systems that can basically oversee the generation if there's solar, the storage if there's battery storage, the usage, and just ongoing optimization of energy use within a home, and then having a two-way dialogue with the grid so that you're either doing things like peak load shifting or peak load shedding to reduce costs, energy bills and energy costs, operating costs, or reduce grid stress. And you're doing things like, say, preheating or pre-cooling spaces during non-peak times, again, to reduce grid stress and costs. We're seeing more interest in cool roof systems and high performance building envelope systems, and then some water solutions like leak detection and water monitoring systems, as well as gray water systems. I love this chart, and I put this into every presentation that I do, because I think this is really telling that resiliency is top of mind for homeowners across the board, but particularly younger generations. So let me give some context for this chart. Home ownership and the desire for home ownership is pretty equal across boomers, Xers, millennials, and Zs at about 80%. With that said, the younger the generation, the more they have considered or are considering moving due to climate change, and the more concerned they are about climate change having an impact on the value of their home. But look at that bottom line. I mentioned the insurance crisis earlier, and this is really indicative of what's happening. The chasm between 16% of boomers saying that climate events are impacting their ability to get insurance versus 77% of Gen Zs. I mean, that is a huge discrepancy. And so younger generations are having problems getting insurance for their homes, partly because of cost, but also because of availability. That's because younger generations are moving into secondary and tertiary markets that are more affordable for them, where they can get attainably priced homes. And some of those markets are in, let's say, the WUI, the wildland urban interface, say Boise, Idaho, or the Mountain West, where insurance companies are really not offering policies because of high wildfire risk. Same thing in superstorm or flood areas that are prone to superstorms, flooding, tornadoes. Et cetera. And of course, older generations are probably in their forever homes already. Many of them are, and they're already grandfathered into their insurance policies. And the reason why we care about these younger generations is that we can see that millennials for the past couple of years have been about half, maybe a little bit over half of all home purchase applications. Whereas you can see the Gen Xers, that's the red line, and boomers, the yellow line, are going down because, as I said, those generations are largely already in their forever homes. What's interesting here is that little orange line, which is Gen Zs, and that's going to grow like a hockey stick over the next couple of years. So clearly, when we say that millennials and Gen Zs have seized the top influencer position in the housing market, it's because they are commanding the bulk of home purchase applications and the home buying and remodeling activity at this point. What's interesting, and I don't have this on this chart yet because they're not there yet, within the next 4 to 5 years, Gen Alphas are going to start hitting the housing market. And those are individuals that were born in starting in about 2010 up to this year, 2025. They are anticipated to be the largest generation in history, the most diverse, and they're going to pull through a lot of these same values that millennials and Gen Zs have, which is net zero carbon, all electric, healthy, resilient, smart homes that have solar plus storage that can help keep them healthy and independent and can take human error out of operating the home in terms of energy efficiency or diagnostics or water conservation. Alphas are also going to pull through a whole new set of expectations in terms of AI in the home, again, to optimize performance. From a design perspective, they're going to pull through new expectations with respect to flex spaces, movable walls, rooms that can serve as a bedroom at night and then let's say a classroom during the day. So very new set of expectations. That's a whole other webinar actually that I present called Generational Marketing. And if you go onto our website at greenbuildermedia.com under our knowledge base and go to our webinars, our archive webinars, I just gave a generational marketing session last month that has some brand new hot off the press data about Gen Alphas, which is very interesting to me because it's new data. Back to decarbonizing the built environment, though, I think what's really most important to note here is that right now, a lot of builders and building professionals are looking at net zero carbon and decarbonization as a factor of differentiation. So there are builders like Mattamy Homes and some like Beazer and KB that are on the leading edge of sustainability in general. And are now exploring net zero carbon. I would say Mattamy Homes out of Canada, but also builds in the US, is probably the most advanced large builder with respect to looking at embodied versus operational carbon, which I'll get into in a minute. But soon, this is not going to be a factor of differentiation or a nice to have because of the evolving regulatory landscape. Of course, the state of California passed 2 climate laws over a year ago now that are going to start requiring businesses over $1 billion in revenue to report scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Again, I'll explain that in a minute. But really what that means is it's not just those businesses that are going to have to report and that are going to be impacted. It's all of their vendors, all of their suppliers. If you are a designer or an architect or a builder and you work with them on office spaces or manufacturing facilities, you are going to actually have to provide reporting so that those businesses can include that in their scope 3 reporting, which, as I mentioned before, remember, that's the whole life cycle of their operations and their products. So we're going to see a big shift starting this year and into 2026 in terms of reporting and compliance requirements for businesses throughout the economy, and particularly in the built environment, as we design and build buildings, not just homes, but buildings for these large businesses. We are, of course, also awaiting to see what happens with the SEC. Do they implement their scope 1 and 2 reporting requirements? Do they step back from that because of what's happening from a deregulation standpoint at the federal level? With that said, we saw the Department of Energy come out with a zero emissions building definition a little over a year ago. That's always the precursor to codes and regulations. The Biden administration came out with a voluntary carbon offset guideline that really defines what high quality carbon offsets mean. Again, I'll get into that in a minute. And then literally from coast to coast, certainly California and Massachusetts are leading the charge with respect to implementing codes that are now requiring things like large commercial buildings actually report scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And we're starting to see that some of these states and municipalities, and again, not just California and Massachusetts, who are leading the charge on, those scope 1, 2, and 3 requirements, but Colorado, New Mexico, New Jersey, and then municipalities, probably not surprisingly, like Boulder and Austin and Berkeley, but not just those municipalities. Houston and Seattle and LA and other municipalities are starting to require things like builders and developers submit net zero carbon plans when they go in to get permits. There are also a lot of cities and states, again, from coast to coast, have set pretty aggressive 2030 net zero emissions goals, which largely rely on solar and energy efficiency in buildings. And then, of course, the electrification of buildings and transportation. And so I actually predict that the next 4 to 5 up to 10 years are going to be very active with respect to those municipalities kind of waking up and saying, wow, we have, 4 or 5, soon to be 3, 2, 1 years to hit our zero emissions goals, and we got to get going. So I think we're going to see a lot of activity with respect to energy efficiency and electrification in the built environment, as well as implementation of renewables, particularly solar plus storage. I think another element that's driving the decarbonization of the built environments is that changing economic landscape, where, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing that shifting valuation metric, where lowest price per square foot is not necessarily the sole metric that's being used. Certainly, affordability is an issue across the board, and will continue to be for quite some time. But again, people realize that first cost is not full cost. The other side of that are the rebates and then the incentives that have been offered, largely due to the Inflation Reduction Act. Most of those funds have already been allocated to the states and cannot be taken back by the federal government. And we haven't really seen, even though we did hear some language about taking that money back, we haven't really seen a lot of effort to do that. With that said, we have to wake up and fight for the continuation for a lot of these rebates and incentives every day. ResNet has put out a petition and a letter to protect 45L, which is an incentive that goes to builders. So $2,500 for them to build Energy Star homes and $5,000 to build zero energy ready homes. And for some builders in some markets, they're actually making money because of this incentive to build higher performance homes. That's not the case across all builders and all markets, depending on the level of performance that they're currently building at. It may take them more and cost them more to get up to an Energy Star or zero energy ready home standard or performance level. But a lot of builders are kind of figuring it out. And then, of course, there's the rebates and the incentives for electrification and energy efficiency technologies that many states are still allocating. So I mentioned that there's kind of those 3 fundamental pillars of getting to net zero carbon. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. We know how to get to net zero design and construction. And these are those sustainable design, building science, and green construction best practices that have been evolving for, the last 20 years since I've been in the business, right? There are wonderful sustainable architects like Peter Pfeiffer and Barley Pfeiffer architects that have pioneered climate responsive design. There are amazing building scientists out there. There are fantastic green builders. We know how to do this. And we actually know how to do this at a cost advantage. We also know how to implement passive heating, cooling, and ventilation strategies. Fortunately, the passive house standard has really, came from Europe and brought a tremendous amount of knowledge here to the US. We know how to optimize and enhance energy efficiency, thermal comfort. We know how to electrify. Again, not in a way that doesn't actually increase costs. And there's always going to be naysayers and pundits that say, oh, it's going to cost so much more. But the real truth is the numbers are there. The case studies are there. Go to greenbuildermedia.com. Check out our recent issue on our Green Home of the Year awards. It was the February issue of Green Builder magazine. Perfect case studies and examples of homes at all levels and price points that are energy efficient, all electric, healthy, smart, resilient, without being more expensive. Clearly renewable energy, advanced technologies for demand side energy management and control optimization. Those, of course, are key as well. Now, what I've been really impressed with is the level of conversation that I am now having and that we, Green Builder Media, as a team are now having with builders and building professionals about measuring embodied carbon and operational carbon. So in case you're not familiar with these terms, embodied carbon basically is the emissions from a home or a building, and I'll just use home for now, up until the day that that home is occupied. So again, like I said earlier, it's everything from the extraction of the first product or material or a material for a product input that goes into that home through to transportation, manufacturing, packaging, more transportation, installation, up until, again, the day that home is occupied. And then operational carbon is emitted once that home is occupied, right? So the operations of that home. And that comes from burning energy and, other heating and cooling and lighting and just operating the home in general. Fortunately, what we are seeing is that there's been a lot of progress in understanding how to at least measure these things. So, for example, ResNet put together a working group to put together or to craft an ANSI standard 1550. It was led by a gentleman named Chris Magwood from RMI. He and that group did a wonderful job of creating this ANSI standard 1550 that will ultimately help streamline the measurement of residential units. So it's applicable to single and multifamily residential units. Chris will be the first to admit that, it doesn't encompass everything that goes into embodied carbon measurements and considerations, but it's a great start. It's a great starting point. And it's something that we just didn't have a year or 2 or 5 years ago. So I think that's really, and I think as we all know, ANSI standards are the precursor to what gets integrated into codes and regulations and requirements, because that is the entity that that municipalities can lean on and refer to that is standardized in order to pull that into, again, their codes, regulations, and mandates. So I think, again, the train has left the station. We're on the journey. If you are not familiar with these concepts, again, go to greenbuildermedia.com, Google, or put in our search box embodied carbon. We have tons of articles and blogs, a webinar by Chris Magwood about ANSI 1550, tons of free resources for you to learn more. So once we address sustainable design, building science, green building, and the performance of a structure, the next step in decarbonizing the built environment, as I mentioned earlier, is the meticulous specification of low carbon products from low carbon companies. So what does that mean? Well, first and foremost, let me say, this is a hard proposition because there's about 20,000 product inputs that go into the typical American home, with about 450 SKUs, which is product types. And, there's really not that many low carbon products to choose from. Fortunately, there's a lot of innovation here, and many manufacturers in our industry, in the building industry, recognize the demand and the urgent need for low carbon products. So they're coming out with environmental product declarations or EPDs or other types of certifications and verifications that showcase the sustainability of products. So EPDs in particular are based on lifecycle assessments or LCA, and they really kind of show the environmental performance and impact of products throughout that life cycle that I mentioned earlier. So again, more and more companies are coming out with low carbon products. But I always like to say that low carbon products are great, and usually they come from low carbon companies, but it's really important to check both, right? Check if there's an environmental product declaration or some kind of certification or verification of a product's impact, but then also look into the corporate sustainability initiatives of that company to make sure that that passes muster for you and that you feel like those corporate sustainability practices are legit. Some companies are backing away from the term ESG or environmental, social, and governance. And, I think that honestly, I don't really have a judgment on that. Like, I don't really care what words they use, whether they use ESG or they back away from it for political reasons or peer pressure or whatever. The companies are going to use the terminology that they're going to feel most comfortable with and that will resonate with their investors and their stakeholders, and that's fine. If they want to call it corporate sustainability, what we are seeing, fortunately, is that most of the companies that we work with that are committed to sustainability are not backing away. Maybe they're changing what they call their ESG report to a corporate sustainability report. But again, the fundamentals are there. They've made the investments, and they're not succumbing to pressure to walk away from those sustainability commitments. What I'm seeing is that the companies that got into sustainability for marketing reasons are the same ones that are walking away for marketing reasons. They weren't really committed, and so they're happy to walk away. But again, I would say the vast majority of companies in the building industry and beyond that we work with are actually not backing away. And in fact, if anything, they're doubling down and recognizing that sustainability, ESG, again, whatever words you want to use, climate risk disclosures, those actually help to reduce risk, enhance profitability, enhance employee morale, attract customers, especially those younger generations, and they provide a lot of other benefits. So more and more companies, as I mentioned, are reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3. I mentioned I would explain these, so here we go. Scope 1 are direct emissions that are owned or controlled by a company. So think about this as emissions that are burned by a company. Scope 2 are indirect emissions that are purchased, usually by a utility. So you can think about those as emissions that are bought or that are purchased. And then scope 3 is everything else, right? Associated with use of manufacturing plants and office buildings and employee travel and packaging and transportation and the use of products in the market and end of life considerations. So again, scope 3 is big and gnarly and hard to get your arms around. It's going to take companies time to implement the scope 3 reporting, but it is inevitable. And what we like to say when we're working with companies, whether they are building professionals or whether they are manufacturers, if you're not already at least thinking about scope 3, it's time to start, because at some point you are going to be required to report on them, whether it's because of your state or municipality, or like in California and soon to come other states, or whether it's from a supply chain partner who's going to require your scope 3 reporting to include in their scope 3 reporting. It's coming at some point. Now, we also know that there is increasing consumer demand for sustainability. And this particular survey actually was from the end of last year. So we utilized the term ESG without any fear or pushback or consideration. We would probably do the same now just because we are a sustainability company. But so for purposes of this survey and this presentation, ESG again refers to environmental, social, and governance. We see that over 75% of our early adopter and first mover consumer audience are more likely to choose a product from a company that has strong ESG practices over one without. And that's a manufacturer, but that's also a builder or a designer or architect or some kind of a service provider. And we see that nearly 60% believe that companies with strong ESG focus are more likely to have long-term financial success than those without. 75% have stopped purchasing products from companies because of concerns over their sustainability practices. And this one's really interesting to me. So about 85% of our early adopter and first mover audience believe that a company's ESG practices impact the quality of its products or services, either a great deal or somewhat. So whether or not that's true, consumers are tying sustainability with the quality of products that a company or services that a company offers. And again, that's really because of the ethic of these younger generations, very high levels of reporting by, say, Gen Zs that they've been greatly affected by climate change. 85% say that they've been impacted by climate change. 64% feel guilty about the negative impact on their environment. And 80% really want to be leaders with respect to making a difference in the world and helping to solve our climate challenges. And 81% believe that companies are an essential part of the solution. Again, very high levels want to be engaged with sustainable companies to develop climate solutions to make their futures better. And 82% say that the more socially and environmentally responsible a company is, the more motivated they are as employees and as customers. But here's the rub with that. Younger generations believe that companies greenwash almost always, very often, or sometimes, let's say. So there's a very high level. We're at historically low levels of consumer trust. And so when we talk with manufacturers or building professionals, especially those that want to leverage sustainability as a differentiator, we really advocate that you ask yourselves the hard questions, not just what are the products or the services, the design services, et cetera, that people want, that will sell and that will make you money, but what will really enhance your customers' lives? What does the world need? How can you create trust? Because right now, trust is the number one factor of differentiation and, frankly, selling point for those younger generations who are fairly disillusioned with business and with the world in general. These are the generations of fake news and mass shootings, and it's hard to really get your arms around what you can and can't believe and what's real. And so I think that as we shift from this model of extracting value by exploiting people and nature to one that really enriches the lives of shareholders and customers and the environment, there is definitely a different model and a different approach to business that I think building professionals and manufacturers can embrace, that provides consumers, home buyers, homeowners, with the personal and the natural connection that they're just aching for right now. I mentioned EPDs, and we're seeing that 85% of our building professional audience are now specifying products with environmental product declarations. That's much higher than ever before. And for those who don't specify, those 15% that don't specify EPDs, half of those say that they'll be specifying products with EPDs in the next year, and the other half basically say within the next couple of years. And interestingly, the priority of EPDs has increased substantially just in the last few years. So just the fact that, 46% of our building professional audience say that EPDs are on par with other certifications like Energy Star, WaterSense, Indoor Air Plus, again, is indicative of the rise of importance of EPDs. About 25% say that EPDs are their top priority. And then a little less, 22% say that they prioritize some of those other certifications over EPDs. But again, the numbers for EPDs have increased substantially. Our 65% of our building professional audience say that their home buyers and homeowners are now looking for EPDs as well. And maybe, about 20%, a little over, say that while their consumer customers might not be specifically familiar with EPDs, they are asking for some kind of sustainability certification or validation to kind of, again, justify claims and provide some kind of real reporting. So we talked about addressing performance through climate responsive design, building science, and green building best practices. We talked about specifying low carbon products from low carbon companies. The last mile to getting to net zero carbon includes carbon offsets. So for those of you not familiar with carbon offsets, one carbon offset is basically the equivalent of taking 1 ton of carbon out of the air. And there are lots of different kinds of carbon offset projects. Some are nature-based, so those might be conservation, tree replanting, mangrove, planting projects. Mangroves happen to be actually excellent carbon sinks, meaning they store a tremendous amount of carbon. And then some projects are not nature-based, but they're technology-based. So those are projects like direct air capture. So you may have heard of the big fans in Scandinavia that are sucking carbon out of the air and storing it into the ground, into limestone or other types of stone and ground areas. There are other technology-based projects like capturing landfill gas or capping abandoned oil and gas mines and wells, or biochar, converting agricultural waste into biochar and storing that under the ground. There's a big chasm, as I mentioned, between high and low quality projects, carbon offset projects. So for example, high quality offset projects address additionality, which means that they wouldn't have happened for another reason, right? They're not issuing carbon offsets, but they would have been conserving the land anyway, right? These projects are specifically reserved for carbon offsets, and it wouldn't have happened anyway. They provide robust and timely data reporting and analytics. Low quality carbon offset projects are kind of, they're not transparent. They don't provide great reporting. The high quality projects eliminate double accounting. So this is this is an example of some of the projects, the low quality carbon offset projects that gave the volunteer offset market a bad rap. There were projects that were, say, planting trees, and they'd plant 1 tree, but then they'd sell 100 or 1,000 carbon offsets based on that 1 tree planting, when in reality they should have sold 1 carbon offset, or the equivalent of whatever that tree planting was, and then retired those offsets, or meaning kind of taken them off the market so that they couldn't be double accounted for. There's other elements, the third-party validation and certification. There's a handful of entities that are now certifying carbon offset projects, like Vera and some others that you want to look for in terms of ensuring that they have those certifications and that validation. And then also just that they offer well-defined pricing and benefits and results, and that those offsets are permanent. This is such a complex marketplace that actually Green Builder Media, about a year ago, a little more, decided to get into the carbon offset marketplace, really just to streamline access to science-backed, high-quality carbon offset projects and just the offsets themselves. So we are actually now selling carbon offsets to builders and to manufacturers to help them get that last mile of net zero carbon in their projects and products and manufacturing. And the reason why that is important, and this is not intended to be a sales pitch. This is really just an FYI, because it's so important to purchase carbon offsets, and you don't have to purchase them from us. Purchase them from wherever. Just purchase the things, because we just don't have enough net zero carbon, construction practices and products to get us to net zero carbon yet. That, we've just got absolutely have to purchase these offsets in order to get to where we need to be with respect to our climate goals. So if you are interested, again, go to greenbuildermedia.com, look for the zero carbon tab on our nav bar, and you can look for our cognition carbon offset marketplace and read all about high quality carbon offsets. You can find out more about what comprises a high quality offset project. You can read about why offsets are important, what a typical American home would require in order to offset its operational carbon. Again, we work with a lot of builders to measure the embodied carbon of their homes, and with manufacturers to measure the embodied carbon of their products. But if you're not familiar with offsets, I would say, again, really please familiarize yourself with them, and please start purchasing them. Again, doesn't have to be from us, wherever you want, but they're very important. So, I just like to wrap up again with a thank you to you all for your time, and a thank you to NKBA for having me. This is kind of big and different thinking, right? The decarbonization of the built environment. There's a lot to unpack there, and this hour today was really just intended to be a primer. We've got about 10 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. But again, I just want to say thank you for being a part of this conversation, because this is the next frontier of the built environment. And I would say the train has already left the station with respect to the nascent and emerging codes and regulations and requirements. And so it's really important that we all understand what our compliance obligations are going to be, but then also really what our moral responsibility and duty is to our home buyers and to our supply chain partners, to our investors and our stakeholders. Or say if you're a smaller designer company, what are those factors of differentiation, and what are the elements of cost competitiveness that you are going to be able to leverage to future-proof your company? How can you figure that into your strategic planning and into your messaging today, so that you're well ahead of your competitors and that you're bringing extra value to your customers? That's really how we're looking at this. So again, thank you, and happy to take any questions that have come up.
Amazing. Thank you, Sarah. We appreciate you coming on and talking about such an important topic. I think it's on the top of everyone's mind, and it's great to get this information. So thank you. With that being said, we have several questions popping in. The first is, if you were a kitchen designer, what would be the most relevant, important takeaways from your presentation? Basically, what do we need to understand, and or what should we do that will have the most impact?
Yeah, great question. So there's a couple of things. One, I would absolutely start looking at products that have those environmental product declarations for kitchen and baths. And a lot of the manufacturers that you probably work with within your purview of kitchen and bath are either have them already, like Kohler has a great sustainability story in general, and they have products with EPDs. A lot of the countertop and surfaces companies now do. I think Dow Tile, Mohawk is flooring. So I'm not sure if you as a kitchen and bath designer get into flooring. Mohawk's a great, great sustainable company with a lot of products with EPDs. But I would ask any company that you specify products from to send you the products that have, send you information about their products that have EPDs. Green Builder Media is about to release a free database that will actually list the companies that we have collected EPDs and corporate sustainability reports from. We're just compiling that and should have that within the next couple of months. So we'll be able to send that out. By the way, I would really recommend, if you haven't already, we have a free e-newsletter called Vantage. If you go onto our website, greenbuildermedia.com, and I think somewhere on the upper right-hand side, you'll see subscribe. And Vantage is our weekly kind of best of roundup e-newsletter. And so kind of our highlights of content. And that's where, for example, we will post this database of products with EPDs, but that's the first thing. And frankly, the lowest hanging fruit in terms of just specifying those low carbon products from low carbon companies is start asking the questions of the suppliers that you work with. The other thing, the flip side of that is, I would, if you're not already, ask your customers what their priorities are and talk with them about, how they can decarbonize their homes, not just in terms of the specification of low carbon products from low carbon companies, but some of the lifestyle decisions that they can make to reduce their emissions. And again, I could spend another hour talking about how they can do that. But if you go onto our website, you can access more information about decarbonizing your customers' lifestyles. And what I would say to you is, especially if you're working with some of those younger generations, even if they're not aware of how to do that, you becoming an essential resource for them and helping them understand what decisions they can make to decarbonize their lifestyles, I bet you anything that maybe not all your customers, and maybe fewer in certain markets, depending on where you're located, but I bet you that many of them will be interested in having that conversation with you and would be very grateful to have you as a resource for that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I know you touched on it on the database that you guys are building with information on suppliers. Can you just go over that again on how they'll be able to access that and when that'll be available, just for anyone who might have missed it?
Yes, so it will be on our website at greenbuildermedia.com, and I would say give us maybe a month and we'll have that listed. But for now, again, if you sign up for our Vantage e-newsletter, it comes out once a week, every Thursday. We try not to bombard people with too many emails. But when we do launch it, it'll be announced in there.
Fabulous, and not too long of a wait, which is amazing. Another question is, what are carbon offsets? How do they work, and what do you mean by purchasing them? So I guess if you could just maybe elaborate a little bit on those.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, one carbon offset is the equivalent of taking 1 ton of carbon out of the air. And again, there's different kinds of carbon offset projects. Some are nature-based, so conservation, tree planting, mangrove planting. Others are technology-based, like direct air capture, landfill gas capture, capping oil and gas wells. But when you buy a carbon offset, basically you're effectively buying again, the equivalent of taking 1 ton of carbon out of the air from one of these carbon offset projects. The key is to purchase from a science-backed, verified, certified, high-quality carbon offset project, and to ensure that your money is going towards a real project that has results that offer permanent carbon offsets. And you can read a lot more about this. Again, go onto our website, greenbuildermedia.com, look for the zero carbon tab in our nav bar, and then go to Cognition Carbon Offset Marketplace. And we have pretty much everything you'll need on there, kind of summarized what the offsets are, what the difference is between a high and a low quality offset. One of the things about offsets is that there are some, hardcore environmentalists that say, oh, if you're allowing people to buy offsets, then you're just allowing them to, emit carbon into the air or pollute, and then say that they're net zero carbon through the offsets. And that's not really how we roll with this. We only work with the builders and the manufacturers and other professionals that are already addressing performance and specifying low carbon products from low carbon companies, because otherwise that's greenwashing, right? And that doesn't do anybody any good. So I think there's a few like buyer beware, keep your eyes open, because there are some nuances to the carbon offset kind of market that you have to pay attention to. And by the way, there's voluntary and required carbon offsets. So like highly polluting companies like oil and gas companies, they're required by the government, the US government and other international governments, to purchase carbon offsets or carbon credits. Everyone else, us, basically, we participate in the voluntary carbon offsets marketplace. So just wanted to kind of clarify that there's kind of 2 layers of the carbon offset and carbon credit market. But again, just so as not to take up too much time, go to our website and check it out, because I think all of your questions should be answered there.
Amazing, thank you. Our next question is, what incentives and rebates will be eliminated due to lowering government budgets?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to address that, but I do see the question right before that about our sustainability symposium, and just want to say to everyone here, if you like this, please join us on April 30th and May 1st. We have a free virtual sustainability symposium. It's from 12 to 3 Eastern both days. You can go onto our website, greenbuildermedia.com. Again, NavBar Sustainability Symposium, and register there. If you can't make it, we'll send you recorded versions, but it's going to be a great couple of days of content. So back to incentives and rebates that will be eliminated. So the real truth is we don't really know yet. It's still kind of up in the air. As I said, a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act funding has already been allocated to the states, and you can't really claw that back. And actually, what's interesting is even the reddest states, a lot of those senators and elected officials are saying, look, we're actually benefiting from these rebates and incentives, so we're not going to give you the money back, even if we agree with your, the politics of it. And so I think, we probably won't see a renewal of a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act and additional funding to support the ongoing funding of a lot of those rebates and incentives, but many of them go through, 2030, 2032, 2035. So there are pools of funding that are in place that are going to stay in place for a while as we experience this transformation of electrification and the enhancement of energy efficiency in homes and buildings, again, in states and municipalities from coast to coast. We're a little bit more aware of what's going to happen with respect to deregulation because the head of the EPA basically came out a couple of weeks ago. And I wrote a blog about this that you can again find on our website that basically said, look, we're rolling back all environmental protections, basically like 31 different environmental regulations and protections. With that said, he can't really unilaterally do that. So, because there's other players in place that have a say in it, and certainly anything he tries to repeal will see its day in court. So there's a lot that's up in the air, and I really don't have a great answer right now in terms of what for sure will be slashed. We know that the DOE, has been slashed in terms of staff and departments that were created to help deploy the funds from the Inflation Reduction Act and other types of energy efficiency and electrification funding. Like that whole department was just cut, and all those people are already all gone. So there's going to be less staffing to make decisions and allocate that, any funding that does still exist. But we're just not quite sure.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. We're out of time, but we do have some questions that we had left over. We'll make sure to answer those via email for anyone that we did not get to today.
Wonderful.
So before we end today, Sarah, I want to give you the floor. If you had any last thoughts or final comments for our audience, some things that they can take as we move forward.
Yeah, just simply that hopefully you can tell I'm so excited about the pace and the extent of transformation that's occurring right now. As I mentioned, I co-founded Green Builder Media 20 years ago. I was in venture capital before that, in organic foods and natural retail, and kind of in the sustainability space. And despite what's happening at a federal level, with frankly, kind of the abdication of federal responsibility for taking climate action, I think that in some ways that just reinforces states and municipalities, and then just people like us who care about this. It reinforces our efforts. It makes us double down. It makes us understand that our work is of paramount importance. And I don't see sustainability or anything that we talked about slowing down. I don't see it getting a boost from the federal government in the next handful of years, of course, but I think that this conversation has never been more relevant. And I think there's huge business opportunities, huge financial opportunities, and of course, huge opportunities to enhance the sustainability of the built environment and the quality and comfort of homes for consumers. And I'm excited. So thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for joining and sharing your expertise with us. And thank you to our audience for taking the time to join today. Until next time, I hope you all have a great day.